to be a
I'm
low.
so impressed. It sounds like we were all dealing with the
same
same.
Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Pew Charitable Trusts in this event, Addressing Retirement Savings Adequacy, a discussion of challenges, successes, and opportunities across the states. My name is Travis Plunkett. I'm the Senior Director for the Family and Economic Stability Portfolio for Pew. Our goal for today's discussion is to inform both policymakers and stakeholders who are working in their own states to improve retirement security for private sector workers. We're excited to host this event and hear from our excellent speakers for several reasons. We recently found that across the country, 30 million full-time, full-year workers in the private sector lack access to retirement plans at their workplace. Now, just to be clear, that's not exciting. What is exciting is that a number of states, as we will hear, are spearheading innovative solutions to deal with that problem. As many in the room and on the web know, retirement plan access and participation varies a great deal across the 50 states. And, as you also know, access to a retirement plan at work is critical because most Americans save for their retirement through employer-sponsored plans. When an employer offers a plan, the vast majority of workers participate. Yet, for a variety of reasons, many employers, especially smaller firms, don't offer a retirement plan. So, to address these challenges, as I intimated, over half the states have introduced legislation since 2012 to either study ways to provide coverage to private sector workers without a workplace plan or start a state-sponsored program to boost coverage. Pew recently released a report that identified 3 broad approaches that states are pursuing, as well as a variety of the policy goals these states are pursuing, and you're going to hear more about that shortly from John Scott. The state legislative leaders and issue experts appearing today are working to improve retirement security using several of these approaches and have a lot of experience dealing with a variety of groups and stakeholders. They are well positioned to provide their insights into what needs to be done from a policy perspective and how best to move policy forward. As usual, they are leading the way, the states are leading the way through their laboratories of democracy. So here's how our afternoon will proceed. To set up our expert discussion, we'll first hear from John Scott. Many of you know John. He's Pew's Retirement Savings Director. He's going to overview the approaches the states are taking. Next, our first panel will feature the insights of 3 state legislators who are leaders on retirement savings issues. Representative Sean Eberhardt of Indiana, Representative Brittany Pedersen from Colorado, and Senator Todd Weiler from Utah. Unfortunately, Delegate Bill Frick from Maryland got stuck in bad weather in the Midwest and can't join us. These state legislators will assess outcomes in their recent legislative sessions and reflect on the challenges and opportunities that exist in their states as they try to move retirement savings policies forward. Our second panel will consist of nationally recognized experts who will take a broad perspective on what retirement savings legislation might look like at both the state and the federal levels in the next year. Our panelists will be Lisa Blyer of SIFMA, the Security Industry and Financial Markets Association, and Jerry Madrid Davis of AARP. Our moderator will be Angela Antonelli of Georgetown University at the Center for Retirement Initiatives. Okay, a couple of housekeeping announcements before we get started. We will have a question-answer period after each panel. For those of you watching on the web, pay attention. You can ask a question whether you're here in the audience or on the web. If you're watching on the web, please email questions to Ken Willis at kwillis, KWILLIS, at pewtrusts.org. His email address will be on the screen. For those attending here at our offices, please note that restrooms are located in the hallway near the elevators. And as a reward for our in-person attendees, there will be a cocktail reception immediately following the events. 1 floor below us on the 9th floor, you can take either the elevator or the stairway down. So let's get started. I'm going to ask John Scott to come on up.
China with Chrysanta, your budget.
Thank you, Travis, and thank you for all of you who are here in person and watching over the web. I'm very excited to be here and to talk about these issues on a day when Britain is deciding whether to stay in the EU and we have major decisions on immigration and affirmative action from the U.S. Supreme Court coming down. I'm glad to see we have such great attendance and interest in what to me is still a very important issue, retirement security for Americans. So what I'd like to do today is just provide some background for the panels. We have a wide range of people in terms of experience and expertise. Many people could do this presentation in their sleep. But then we have a number of people, especially those tuning in from, I think I counted about 16 states and some municipalities, who are just getting into the retirement policy space for the first time. And so in an attempt to sort of get everybody on the same page for the subsequent discussion, let me just go over a few key items, and hopefully I'll do this briefly so we can get to the heart of the matter.
I just want to go to dinner.
There we go. So I think you have to really start off with the problem, and what is retirement policy trying to do? We know that we're living longer, and part of that then is how do we fund or how do we ensure retirement security as we live longer, we have longer periods of retirement. At the same time, we have a lot of expenses that are predictable or at least very probable. Long-term care is only one of those expenses that we can expect to see in retirement. And these expenses can be quite large. At the same time, while many people are covered by Social Security and they may have Medicaid and Medicare available to them, defined contribution savings, which would supplement Social Security or at least provide a financial cushion against some of these expenses in old age, is pretty low, even for those who are on the cusp of retirement in their late 50s and early 60s. So there are a number of challenges, and I know there's a debate about whether this is a crisis and whether we will truly have enough for a decent standard of living. But I think almost everyone who works in this area agrees that we need to do more to encourage retirement savings. We haven't had any major federal legislation in this area in 10 years. This is, in fact, the 10th anniversary of the Pension Protection Act. I just would note that there's going to be an event tomorrow hosted by the Aspen Institute on Capitol Hill that will be talking about the Pension Protection Act and maybe some next steps at the federal level. But into the sort of void of policy at the federal level, we've had a lot of activity going on at the state level. And part of it is or most of it is dealing with this problem of access and participation. And we know that most Americans get their retirement savings through the workplace, through employer-sponsored retirement plans. The vast majority of Americans don't save for retirement outside of the workplace. But we see that retirement access or access to retirement plans varies widely across the 50 states. And just to put some numbers on this map, and just talking about access to a retirement plan at the workplace, 46% of full-time, full-year workers in Florida have access, not participating, but have access to a retirement plan. At the top of the range, we have Wisconsin at 70%. And while Wisconsin certainly is the leader in terms of access and participation, as you can see, what this still means is that there are 400,000 full-time, full-year workers without access to a retirement plan in Wisconsin. So there's a lot of challenges in each of the states. There are a lot of factors that we've identified and others have identified through research that's associated with the lack of access and lack of participation. Small employers, for example, are much less likely to offer a retirement plan to their workers. Certain industries like construction and leisure and hospitality industries have much lower rates of access as compared to others like financial services. Lower income households, workers have less access to retirement plans, in part because many low-wage jobs don't provide benefits or much in the way of benefits. And of course, lower income workers are constrained in their ability to save. And then other factors as well. Younger people, millennials very famously, have much lower rates than older workers. Education, race, and ethnicity all factor in, and all these factors interact to sort of produce that variation that we saw on that state map. So this is sort of the nature of the problem. But as I mentioned, states are jumping into this area with a variety of proposals. As Travis mentioned, over half the states have introduced legislation. Several have actually enacted legislation and are in the process of implementing a variety of programs. And this is very exciting. And obviously we have some people on the first panel who not only represent different parts of the country, but represent different approaches to the retirement savings problem. So, here we go. In a recent report, we looked at a lot of the state legislation and we identified three basic policy goals. One, of course, is increasing retirement savings. Another is minimizing burdens for employers, particularly those small employers that I mentioned. And then, of course, managing the legal and financial risks for the states. That states want to do something, but they want to do it in a fiscally responsible way and in a way that's feasible. The problem is not all these goals are aligned very neatly, and sometimes there have to be trade-offs amongst these goals. And that's one of the things that I hope we get into today, are what are some of those trade-offs. Now, just to set the background for the first panel, the states that are interested in getting into this area are faced with a couple of threshold questions. One is whether or not a state program should be subject to the federal law that regulates retirement plans in this country, known by its acronym ERISA, or not. So that's a threshold question, whether they want to operate as under ERISA's rules or outside of it. And the second one is whether the state actually wants to be a plan sponsor or just in some way facilitate retirement savings without actually providing a plan to workers. And what that leads to is, and I hope I can make this pointer work, I probably cannot, but that gives us three basic approaches that you see on that 2x2 table. As a social scientist, I live and die by 2x2 tables. But you have the marketplace approach, you have the prototype or multiple employer plan approach, and the auto IRA, and we expand on this in the next slide. So a state could certainly operate a state plan or sponsor a plan under ERISA, the federal rules. And this is generally done in a couple of very similar ways. One, they could operate a prototype plan, which is basically providing a template that individual employers can adopt as their own plan. Or they can organize a multiple employer plan where effectively there's one plan that brings in a number of different employers. In both cases, the state is really acting as an administrator and providing oversight, doing a lot of the backroom functions that lower the cost of providing these plans. And an example here is in Massachusetts, where they're providing a prototype plan for small nonprofit organizations. The second approach, and the one that has generated a lot of legislative interest, is where the state operates a plan outside of ERISA. This is the payroll deduction auto IRA approach. In some places it's called the secure choice approach or some other alternative names. But here the state is basically facilitating a payroll deduction program. The employer is not involved at all except to remit the contributions. They flow to IRAs that are held for the individual employees. And we have examples of this where the states of Connecticut, Illinois, Maryland, and Oregon are actually implementing this approach. And then the third one is where the state is not offering a plan by itself or on its own behalf, but is working within the ERISA system by providing a marketplace. And this is in the sense of the state is facilitating both financial service providers to offer products to small employers and then encouraging small employers, not requiring, but trying to sort of help the two come together so that small employers can adopt more plans. And we're seeing this in Washington State and New Jersey. So these are the three basic approaches that we're seeing out there. Now, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, there's a lot of words, but I think the point here that I want to make, and hopefully we'll get into during the panels, is that there's a lot of choices that are facing policymakers that want to do something in this area. For example, in the first bullet, what's the nature of employers' participation? Are we going to require employers to participate, or is it going to be voluntary? What are the responsibilities and roles of employers in terms of, say, communication or education? What are their liabilities? A very key question on the part of employers. How do we enroll employees into the program? How do we remit the contributions, and how does it flow? How do employees have access to money that they've contributed to a state plan, for example? And then finally, not finally, but third, how are those contributions invested and how are the savings protected, both the savings and the investment returns? And should they be protected, and to what degree? And then, of course, we have administration and governance questions. What's the role of the state in terms of being say, for example, a plan sponsor or an organizer? So these are the nature of the questions that you can get into and should get into in these policy conversations. And just one last thing here, I wanted to talk about the policy trade-offs, and one sort of simple example. The state of Illinois has a program that they're implementing that would require employers with 25 or more employees to enroll their workers into the Illinois Secure Choice program. But once, if we sort of drop that 2 in the 25, and if the law instead required 5 or more employers with 5 or more employees to be part of this program, we'd see an increase in coverage of 700,000 workers. On the other hand, some would say that this may be too much of a burden for small employers that are just trying to make payroll and maybe not as financially secure as somewhat larger companies. So this is the nature of the trade-off that I hope we get into today in our conversations. With that, let me call up our first panel. And I'll sort of introduce them in turn. So first I'd like to call up Representative Brittany Pedersen. Representative Pedersen was first elected in 2012 to represent House District 28, which is near Denver. Before launching her campaign, Pedersen worked for New Era Colorado, a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to engaging youth in government and politics, and for candidates and causes focusing on education, the environment, and renewable energy. She studied political science at Metro State University, earning her degree and becoming the first in her family to graduate from both high school and college. Next, I'd like to invite Representative Sean Eberhardt from Indiana, who was first elected in 2006 to represent District 57, which is just a little south, I think, of Indianapolis. He attended Purdue University and received a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Engineering, as well as an MBA from Indiana University. After receiving his MBA, he started his own business, Advantage Tool Rental, a rental and sales company. And then finally, Senator Todd Weiler of Utah, who is a Republican member of the Utah State Senate, representing District 23, which is just north of Salt Lake City. Senator Weiler earned a business degree from Brigham Young University. He went on to obtain his JD from the J. Reuben Clark School at Brigham Young University. And he's currently employed as an attorney in addition to his duties in the Utah State Senate. All of you, and I'd just like to sort of start off the conversation, and I start off the brief presentation, talking about the nature of the retirement savings problem. Could I ask each of you to take a couple of minutes to just talk about what motivated you or what's motivating you to get involved in retirement security, in your district, in your state? So maybe.
Sure. I was actually appointed to the Utah Senate in run for the U.S. Senate against Orrin Hatch, and I won a special election and was appointed by the governor to take his place. And because I came in midterm, Dan Lillenquist had been the chairman of the Senate's Retirement Committee, so I inherited that position from him, and he was a great mentor in that. And so that's when I got into the retirement business. I didn't really know a lot, beyond that. And so Senator Lillenquist had just done some phenomenal reforms in Utah to really stabilize our retirement system moving forward. Of course, the recession in in the 2008-2009 timeframe really made us unbalanced, and we were forced to kind of cut off our defined benefit plan moving forward. We started what we call a Tier 2 in Utah in 2011. So any state employee or state system employee hired after July 1st of 2011 would be in a defined contribution plan, and we wanted to keep our promises to the employees in the defined benefit pool. And so Senator Lillenquist pushed through this reform, did a marvelous job, and then left to try to bring that type of thinking to Washington. He was unsuccessful in his bid for U.S. Senate, but then I got to pick up all of the fallout and all of the unintended consequences and things like that. And I don't blame him, because any major piece of legislation is going to take several years to kind of work through, but that's kind of how I got thrown into it. And then I started working with AARP several years ago on this issue that Americans and Utahns in particular crisis. I just don't know what will happen, especially if, as many Americans expect, if our Social Security program ends, and that's probably a program that is too big to fail. But if it doesn't end, it's certainly going to get, I expect, curtailed through asset tests, and I think they'll keep on pushing the age higher and higher. But I think more and more citizens, voters, more of the population are going to be looking to the state government as their safety net when they retire. I think the average Americans, if you take out the outliers, I think the average American has about $5,000 saved for their own retirement. What are they going to do? I mean, what are they going to do if the federal government's not going to step in and give them health care and a monthly check? Who else is left? And so as a Republican, I approach this issue that anything the government could do to kind of prime the pump, if you will, and to help people be more self-reliant, more independent, less reliant on government as a safety net, I thought fit very nicely with my Republican principles. And so if you don't know, Utah is a red state. Our legislature is about 85% Republican majority in both the House and the Senate. And so that's how I got involved in this issue. And I believe, and I've spoken a little bit partisan, but I believe this is an issue, number one, that the state government should be engaged in, and number two, I think it transcends partisan boundaries. I think this is something that Republicans and Democrats can stand side by side and say, this is something that we agree on, that people need to do a better job at saving for their own retirement.
Well, I didn't realize there was such a problem with lack of participation in retirement savings plans until AARP approached me and asked for my help in drafting a bill. And it was no coincidence that I received my application for AARP in January, and I filed the bill 2 weeks later, so there was no connection there. But didn't realize there was such a need. I'm a small business owner, have been for 19 years. I don't offer a plan to my employees. I've only have 4 employees. For a few different reasons, I don't offer it. And so when in my discussions with AARP and how they wanted to approach it, it seemed like a pretty good approach, a logical approach for a small business owner like myself and all the rest of the businesses in Indiana. I'm very interested in an approach that keeps the government out of it as much as possible, doesn't put a whole lot of requirements on the businesses themselves, and I thought the approach that we took in Indiana, although it was unsuccessful, was the right step. Hopefully we'll have a chance to look at this bill and this topic again next session. I filed the bill. It was called the HERO Bill, the Hoosier Employee Retirement Option Bill. Unfortunately, again, it wasn't successful, but I hope to continue working on the issue.
Representative Pedersen?
Thank you. Well, I think we all have something in common is that our bills ultimately were not successful, but we're here because this issue is one of the biggest issues facing Colorado and the nation. I was elected in 2012 and worked for candidates and issues before I actually ran myself. But learning about what we're facing currently in Colorado and where we're going to be if we don't act is alarming. I'm a millennial, and we are significantly disadvantaged when it comes to access to retirement plans. The first time I had access to a retirement plan was when I actually chose to run for office and won. So I finally have a retirement savings account, but unfortunately many people in my generation do not. I have worked low-wage jobs. I was never asked about a retirement savings plan. So something that we looked at in Colorado was kind of taking the Illinois model, and to increase enrollment is just having it automatic, having the option to actually choose the percentage that you'd like to put away, making it easy for small businesses when they're filling out their tax paperwork for new employees, and ensuring that everybody does have access to this. And if they don't want to save, they can actually opt out. And so this would significantly increase the likelihood of participation, especially in those low-wage jobs where women and minorities and younger workers are highly affected. So this is something that it definitely affects my generation. If we don't act, we are going to face a retirement crisis.
That's great. Thank you for that. And so let me just, before I ask you the next question, let me just repeat what Travis mentioned at the outset, that we will be taking questions, not just from the in-person audience, but also if you're watching over the web, we have, I'm not sure you can see it, but I think they'll be flashing on the screen the email for Ken Willis. Feel free to send those questions in, and hopefully Ken will give me the high sign that questions have come in, so please feel free. So you've talked about some of the different motivations and referred a little bit to your legislative proposals. I had mentioned in the presentation that there are some, three basic approaches, and obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but there is some variation even within those approaches, and I think probably reflective of local constituencies and conditions in each state. Could you just maybe describe in a little more detail, between those three approaches, what's your preference and why you want to go down a particular path, whether it's the marketplace or the auto IRA approach? Maybe Representative Pedersen, we'll start at the other end of the, of the chairs.
That sounds good. Well, I think that the marketplace version, I think that there's definitely a need for that. I think that increasing access to information and for small businesses about options that are out there is absolutely part of solving this problem. But unfortunately, you're still leaving 50% of the population out, 50% of the employees who will still not be offered a retirement savings plan at work. And so that's why incorporating the automatic enrollment and actually having a state plan where you have big bargaining power, you're going to have lower fees, you're going to have smaller dollars coming in. But ultimately, you have the ability to make the best investments for your constituents. And so I think that it doesn't have to be one or the other, but the marketplace is not going to actually address all of the needs of the people in our communities.
Well, again, being a limited government guy, we took the marketplace approach where the state's role was only to create and host a portal, an internet portal site to connect small businesses and folks that work independently, connect them to private plans. And so what we did, we created a 7-person board that would set this portal up, that would be responsible for the maintenance, to decide what type of plans could be listed on the site. Again, these are all private plans. There's no state-sponsored plan. And it would simply allow the connection between the private marketplace and the small businesses. We limited it to the businesses that had less than 100 employees. And our approach was to make sure that the plans that were listed would be low-cost, simple plans, and so that's the approach we took.
Well, I'm going to be blunt. I would not vote for any state legislation in Utah that made our state subject to ERISA. So if I wouldn't vote for it, I wouldn't sponsor it. I mean, that for me is a deal breaker. I took an ERISA class in law school. I know enough about ERISA to be dangerous, and I would never voluntarily subject my state to ERISA. Now, that might be offensive to some of you, but that's me being honest. So that's number one. Number two, I probably couldn't vote for a mandate either, a mandate on employees. And so the opt-out approach that Colorado tried was not really an option for me. And regardless of whether I would vote for that or sponsor it, I don't believe my colleagues would support a mandate on small businesses. Now, I'll be the first to recognize that the mandate would be the most successful approach because it takes affirmative action on the part of the business or the employee to opt out of it. So I ran a bill that was designed to not subject the state of Utah to ERISA and would be primarily opt-in for both the employee and the employer. The bill that, and let me just give some background. In the 2015 session, I ran a resolution that basically framed the issue and called on the business community to join with me as a state senator and our state treasurer, who was then Richard Ellis and is now David Damshin, to kind of work to find a solution. So that resolution passed unanimously or nearly unanimously in the 2015 Utah legislature and was signed by the governor. And then the state treasurer and we organized a working group. We met 6 times during the summer and fall of 2015. We held town halls. We had, Fidelity there. We had, some of the bigger banks and others, and got a lot of really good input. And then I took that and I parlayed that into a piece of legislation for this year, 2016, that I expected would get a lot of support. And that was the program I outlined. And what I actually did, the final version of the bill that passed the Senate almost unanimously, the Utah Senate, basically would have provided a tax incentive for any small business, a qualifying small business employer under 100 employees who didn't already have a retirement plan with a payroll deduction available to their employees. They could get a tax incentive not just for signing up for a state plan. They could get a tax credit, if you will, for signing up for any plan out there that allowed a payroll deduction. So for me, it was a very market-based solution. So, and we decided to target the small business owners because we believe that they're busy and they're overworked, and a lot of them would rather have a root canal than start comparing different retirement plans. And just to dangle, my plan was a $500 tax credit, and we were going to just do it for a year. Again, my philosophy was we're going to prime the pump. And so we're going to try to get the attention of these small business owners to say, hey, if you'll just sign up for a plan and offer it to your employees this year, you can get a $500 tax credit. And my thought was that we would basically empower the private sector, all of the existing plans out there, to reach out to their customers and the salesmen that are the army of salesmen that were out there, and so that they could start knocking on doors and saying, hey, if you sign up for our plan right now, whatever their plan was, you can get a $500 tax credit. So I thought it was a very Republican-friendly proposal. But part of the proposal, and I thought this was essential, was having our state treasurer, we were going to issue a RFP, and have our request for proposal, and have our state treasurer vet a couple of plans, and my bill said 1 or more plans, where the state treasurer would vet the plans and put his or her stamp of approval, fingerprint, and say, these plans have been vetted and these are okay. Because what I believed an essential part of this was to tell the employers, the small business employers, you don't have to do this homework. And we've already looked at a few plans, and here's some good ones. That was the part of my bill that the private sector, that the big industry objected to. So I got my bill through the Senate almost unanimously, and then there was an intense lobbying effort in the House to kill my bill because they didn't want one plan approved over another plan. The reason that was also important is my bill was aimed at a lot of blue collar. I was hoping a lot of blue collar people, workers, would sign up. And I think one of the things that you'll find in all three of our states, because we've talked about this, is we all were seeking for plans that would have a low amount of management fees. I didn't want a blue collar employee donating $20 a paycheck and losing half of that to management fees. And so that's part of what we wanted this RFP to deal with. And so I think that the business sector, they liked the fact that I was running this plan, but they were afraid that their particular business would not get the treasurer's stamp of approval. And then we were going to use state resources. So, for example, our Department of Workforce Services emails out, and our tax commission has a website. So we were going to advertise these state sanctioned plans through mailings that were already going out. We would stick a kind of an insert in there and have links on websites. So we were going to promote the state plan in a very efficient way through existing resources. But that was the part of my bill that sunk it, and I haven't given up. I'm going to come back. I'm up for re-election in November, but I've already secured the Republican nomination, and I live in a Republican district. So barring a plane crash or something, I'm hoping to get re-elected in November, so I'll have 4 more years to work on this. And I haven't completely given that up, but I may have to migrate something more like Indiana was pursuing, which is, I think now is called the Washington model. And, quite frankly, I was hesitant to do that. We set up an exchange of insurance programs before the ACA was passed. It's called Avenue H, for H standing for health. And it was on life support until the mandate, the congressional mandate was imposed, and now it's doing fine. But again, because of that mandate, I think it's kind of poisoned the well for any other mandate, at least, that would be generated on the state level. So.
We're hopeful to get Delegate Frick from Maryland here. Maryland obviously has passed a law, but I think it was important to really get the perspectives of state leaders who are still working on this issue and intend to work on this issue, because as we noted, well over half the states have been active on this issue. Only a handful have actually passed something. So I think there's a lot of activity, and to get your insights, as Senator Weiler just went into, some of the challenges. So let me sort of build off of what you just said, maybe ask Representative Everhart and Pedersen, what are the challenges that you faced in trying to get your bills through, either from interest groups or just other issues, education or whatever it might be, that might be useful for people from other states to hear?
Well, Senator mentioned the intense lobbying effort when it reached the House in Utah. I had that from the very beginning, from the financial services industry and the banking industry, and their fear that somehow this was going to be a government-run deal, and that they would be left out, and that some way that their plans would not be included. That was the biggest issue that I had. And then also inside the chamber itself, a lot of my colleagues feared that this would lead, or this was a state-run, state-sanctioned program, which Republicans hold a supermajority in both the House and the Senate in Indiana, and core principles of being a Republican is limited government, and so when that fear is stoked, it becomes very difficult to get those type of bills passed. I don't believe that was. I know it's not. It wasn't the intent of the bill. I think it's just a matter of more education on my part and some others to really let folks know what this bill is all about. We have over 1 million, and some of your statistics were up on the board, over 1 million Hoosiers that don't have access to a employee-sponsored plan, including my business. Again, I don't have a plan, and my bill would have made it a lot easier for folks to opt into a plan. Again, it's a choice. It's not.
Security program on the state level in Utah. I mean, which was a blatant lie. But when you're at the end of a session and you're trying to, consider hundreds of bills in a matter of hours, those lies were very effective.
Right.
And again, I would never run such a bill, much less ask anyone else to vote for it.
Well, I had similar pushback. We let the financial industry lobbyists know that we were looking at this bill and working on it. I think that having them involved more from the beginning would have been helpful, but as you were talking about, it goes by, session flies by, and you're working on a ton of bills, and everybody is seeing lots of bills in committee, and so we got towards the end as well, and there was some misinformation that was hard to combat. We decided to actually postpone our bill indefinitely to work on it some more for next year, and so I think ensuring that you have, that private sector feedback from the very beginning and trying to work with them is essential, probably obvious as well. But I think that what was difficult for me, and in being here talking about this, I think that there's a way to include and to involve the private sector and to involve banks, while also realizing that we have to address the 50% of the population that are still not going to be offered these plans. And so if there was a way to ultimately engage these individuals with the automatic enrollment, and these are people who unfortunately are unlikely to save, they start to see the benefits of saving, and over time they can make different decisions, and you have a whole group of consumers that you wouldn't have had access to before, I believe. And so I think that that's down the road will be good for those businesses, as well as potentially limiting the amount that somebody makes that has access to these options. I think that from a banking perspective, you get worried about possible consumers not being out there to go out and talk to. And so I think that when we all have to recognize that some of these individuals, it would cost way too much money, and you're not going to have the benefit in the end to actually engage as many people as you need in these options. And so I hope to have business come to the table on trying to address this issue, on ultimately helping their business in the future, but recognizing that we have a crisis in Colorado that we need to deal with together. So
Let me now, I'm going to open up to questions here in a second, just to give you fair warning. But you mentioned, each of you mentioned some of the obstacles you face from, I assume, lobbyists or the financial services industry. Just how can the private sector, whether it's employers or financial services, or even nonprofit groups like Pew's and others, how can these stakeholder groups help on moving the policy forward instead of just being an obstacle? What would you like to see them do to be helpful?
Well, I was asking for input, and let's be clear, these were lobbyists for the financial services sector. They weren't just lobbyists who appeared out of nowhere. I was asking at every stage, give me some edits, give me some changes, tell me how I can improve the bill to alleviate some of your fears. And so finally, one of them did, but what they presented to me was not an edit; it was a completely different bill. And one of the lobbyists for the financial services was pushing me. They said, "Well, if you want a state-sponsored plan, use MIRA or MyRA, which is so I didn't know what that was, and so I looked into it, and it's basically a federal program. It only allows you to invest in Treasury bonds. That's it. That's your whole selection, which yield about a 2% return on the average, and you max out at $15,000 a year, and then my RA is done." And I said, no, I could not in good conscience recommend that to anyone. I wouldn't recommend that to my worst enemy as their only retirement savings option. And so that was the option they gave me. And unlike Colorado, I just want to say, I'm a lawyer. I'm a trial attorney. I wanted my day in court. And so even though I delayed my bill for a couple weeks trying to gain support, I went into a hostile House committee hearing at the very last week of our session. It was the last night for hearings. And at 10 o'clock, I had a very combative House hearing on my bill. I knew I didn't have the votes. I knew where every committee member was because I had lobbyists on my side that were helping me. And so we knew we didn't have the votes. But I went in and I told this Republican-dominated committee, I basically said the status quo has failed us. Right now, the average Utah, well, by the way, 51% of the residents of my state, of the employees, working employees, do not have the option of a payroll deduction at work. And I think that statistic holds nationwide. And so for anyone who's saying that this is a problem that the private sector is best positioned to handle, the private sector has failed us. Over half of the employees in my state don't have the payroll deduction option at work. And we know nationally that if you have that payroll deduction option at work, you're 15 times more likely to save for your retirement. Those are startling statistics, and they're irrefutable statistics. And so I basically laid out my case to this House committee and said the status quo is failing us. We are heading towards a cliff. And in 20 years, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of people retiring who cannot support themselves, and they're going to be looking for the state. So if that's what you want, fellow Republicans, if that's what you're okay with, is everyone becoming completely dependent on a state-sponsored government safety net, please vote against my bill. But if you want to try something unique, if you want to try priming the pump so that we can have people more self-reliant and saving for their own retirement and less dependent on government, then please vote for my bill. And I wanted to frame the issue that way and make them vote. And my bill lost because they had been lobbied. So
I think it's all about education for me. I had a late start with the bill, and I think it's more of a matter of me educating my colleagues on what it is and what it isn't. It's been unfairly portrayed in my mind as far as my bill. And I really want to get on record the financial services and banking lobbyist. I did not have a chance to have a hearing, but I would either like to have some type of summer hearing or some type of hearing where we can actually have testimony and I can hear the reasoning from the groups that are against the bill, because I don't think that those arguments will be that powerful, and I'll have a chance to have on record those folks and then be able to show that to my colleagues. I mean, and Brittany mentioned it, this is the people that we're focused on with my bill is a clientele that these large firms don't target anyway. They're not going to go after a small business like mine. There's no real money that they can make in regards to these type of clients, and so it's a clientele that I'm focused on with my bill that they more than likely would not care to get involved with anyway. So I think it's bottom line. I think it's education for me.
Well, if I think about what we could ask businesses and people that ask the banking industries, our financial institutions, and also the people that actually support these ideas, is to come together to look at ways that we can address these areas, these concerns that we have for individuals who are never been targeted, haven't increased their retirement savings in 30 years. It's been consistently at the same level. And so working together on how we can solve that problem and also increase opportunities for our businesses and for other options. I guess what was frustrating for me is that the feedback that I got was we need to provide more financial literacy early on, which all of us can absolutely agree on. But that doesn't solve the problems of people who are past our K-12 system. You showed the slides earlier, your education, where you live, your gender, your race, all of these things are going to affect whether or not you're actually in a job where you would have access to a retirement security plan. And so you're still not actually getting at the population that we're talking about right now. And I think in recognizing that things are changing. We are seeing a reduction in access, and that's why we're all here today to talk about this. We have a new shared economy, people working multiple jobs, multiple contracts to try to make ends meet. And retirement plans are definitely not an option. So I guess, why I came to this to be with you today is to hear about what other states are doing, to hear from the experts in the room about what we can be doing together to actually, ensure that everybody's at the table and that we can actually solve these problems together. So.
Terrific. I think we do have a question from the web, and then we'll. It's pretty long. Thank you. Nice phone, Ken. So here's the question. The initial build-out costs in establishing and operating these programs is very high, says the questioner. At the same time, most legislative proposals restrict state funding of the costs. Under these circumstances, how do you ensure that state workers enrolled in these programs do not end up paying the administrative costs that erode any returns generated by the program? And I think what they mean is, how do you ensure that, not public workers, but how do you ensure that the participants in these programs that we've been talking about do not end up, having the administrative costs coming out of their retirement savings, which I think you spoke to a little bit.
So that's the build-up cost for a state marketplace, at least for our insurance exchange in Utah, was quite high. I think it was over $1 million. The fiscal note on my bill, Utah, unlike the federal government and some other states, we are actually required by our state constitution to balance our budget every year. And so every bill that we run runs through a fiscal analysis. And so they have people smarter than me try to gauge, if this bill is passed, what's the fiscal impact. And we have to fund that out of this year's revenue or the next year's revenue in order to pass the bill. And so I ran a bill that had almost zero startup costs. I mean, it was less than $100,000. The state treasurer's office was going to issue an RFP, and they would be looking at some plans. So they had some component of an FTE in there. But once the plan got going, it would be self-administered. We were going to farm it out to a financial service industry who won the RFP. And so our costs were low because my number one objective was to keep those management fees low. I don't know that that's the same number one objective that the financial service industry has.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, with my plan, there was a 7-person board that would have been created that would have been responsible for the startup and of the plan, and then also, or the program, and then also to decide the criteria for what plans could be listed on the website. And the number one thought was that they should be low cost. And I think we all agree with that there should be no erosion of one's retirement based on those fees. And so I thought we had enough checks and balances in place that would prevent high cost, high fee programs from being listed on the portal. And then again, the fiscal note that we had didn't amount to a whole lot on the creation of this portal and the maintenance of it. So I don't think there was a whole lot of concern on the cost to create it.
Ours would have had an upfront cost, but also it would have capped fees that could be charged. And so while the fees were very limited in ensuring that our Colorado citizens were getting the best investment possible, ultimately over time it was much less than you would have paid with the other investment options. And so I think that one thing that we did to make sure that the small businesses weren't actually out of pocket for anything in actually giving the form for the individuals to fill out, for example, was that they could actually apply to be reimbursed for any costs that were accumulated. And so some people were worried that would all of a sudden then they would be subject to ERISA because they were receiving a payment. So ERISA came up a lot, and I think it clouded the conversation because I think that there's a lot of unknowns about that, and it's easy to provide misinformation. But with the new federal guidelines with the Department of Labor, they're trying to ensure that these plans can exist, and they've actually provided guidelines to ensure that happens. So I think that there's much more clarity out there than people want to recognize.
And let me just clarify, if I could. The Department of Labor issued these proposed guidelines, I think, in November, and then the comment period ended in mid to late January. And we're still waiting for the final rules to come out. I will say that one of the reasons I ran the resolution calling for the work group in 2015 instead of the actual bill was because we were waiting for the Department of Labor. A year and a half later, we're still waiting for the Department of Labor, and
You're
I
not
was
the only one.
yeah, I for one, speaking for myself, was very disappointed when the proposed rule came out in November, and I had attended some conferences. I think you were there with me when we had some high-ranking officials from the DOL tell us the direction they thought they were going in, and that wasn't the direction. I'm hopeful that with the comments that were submitted, that we'll see some changes in that. But I was able, with the help of my able legislative attorney staff, we were able to find some loopholes, some ERISA loopholes that pre-existed this DOL. The DOL regulation was a knee-jerk reaction, I think, to what Illinois and California and some other states were doing. And so, but when it first came out, I read that as we either, if we didn't want an ERISA governed plan, we had to do an employee mandate. And so for me, I felt like I was checkmated. But we did find some pre-existing loopholes that had been carved out, I think, in the late 1970s that my plan was kind of structured under. So the DOL stuff has been nothing but discouraging for me.
Do we have some questions from the audience? Yes, over here. Let's, Melissa Kahn, yeah? Let's get you a mic so everyone can hear.
Thanks, John. Kudos to all of you. You are all tackling a problem that is incredibly important to our country. So I want to applaud you all, and I'm sorry you're having so much problems from the industry. But I do have a question, both on the voluntary type approaches, the marketplace, as well as the secure choice approach. Both are commendable. It's better than nothing kind of thing. But on the voluntary, I'm curious how you think you're going to be able to get people, like a significant amount of employers, to go to the marketplace. We've had a voluntary system for many decades now, and voluntary, bless you, has not seemed to solve the problem. So that's for you. And also on secure choice, because of the DOL rules, obviously there are a lot of restrictions in there, and so people are only going to be able to put in up to the IRA limits. And so you need to let people know that for many people that's not going to be sufficient. So, we don't want to give people a false sense of confidence that they're going to have saved enough. So I'm curious how you're planning to tackle both of those issues.
So let's deal with the voluntary portion of the question first. So I think it's directed to you two.
Yeah, so mine was a two-tiered approach. Number one, I wanted to dangle some money to get the CEO, the business owner's attention, and then I wanted to make it easy for them. And that was the idea that we could tell them the treasurer has already looked at all these plans, and here's 2 or 3 that the treasurer has given his stamp of approval to. That was my plan, and I think for Utah, I think it was the right plan. So,
Well, the easy part, I agree. I wish I would have thought of the financial incentive, and that may be something I may come back with as far as a tax credit. That would mean a lot to me, being a small business owner, and that would certainly be a big carrot for me. It has to be simple. I think we have to get education out there as far as that this portal, as far as my plan was concerned, that is available. Take a quick look at it, make it simple to be able to opt in as an employer. But again, I'll never, I guess I was told long ago never to say never, but I'm not in the market to support any type of mandate. I probably would not carry a bill or support a bill that would have any type of mandate that the employers have to participate. The plan that I had was that if the employee or the employer opted in, then all your employees would then be part of that plan unless they opted out. So there was a little bit of just a small bit of a mandate in there, but I think it comes down to education, making it easy. I don't have an HR department, being a small business, so you have to make it easy for those folks to participate.
And maybe the second part of the question, which hopefully I'm going to characterize correctly, Melissa, and this is Melissa Kahn from State Street Global Advisors, and probably directed more towards Representative Pedersen. With a lot of these secure choice programs, it's 3% or 5% of pay, and then you have the limits on the IRAs. Not a lot of money can be contributed under these sorts of programs. How do you deal with that?
Well, thank you for the question, and I think that addresses that this is not a one size fits all, and this is only part of the solution, and why we need our financial industries at the table and ensuring that other options are available for individuals who would contribute more. But that is still, we're talking about a population that are unlikely to save and also unlikely, if they're involved in this program, to want to contribute beyond their limitations. And so what we did in Colorado, we had the 5% automatic unless you said less or more otherwise. And so it was at 5%, which is still not enough to ultimately save for retirement, but at least it's going to put them in a better position to not be in poverty as seniors. And so I think that it's only part of the solution. And then one thing that we've discussed is for employers to actually, when they are offering retirement plans, if they made it automatic, that they automatically enrolled, if they had an opt-out system for their employees, that they had to actually check the box to say they didn't want to save for retirement, that would actually increase the likelihood of individuals who are being offered these accounts from their employers.
Would you, just to follow up on that, would you consider, I think you said it's 5% under the Colorado legislation that you sponsored, would you consider any sort of automatic escalation of the contributions? Say you start at 5% and the next year it goes to 6 and 7, you can still opt out if you wanted to, if you're an employee. Is that something that would be appealing, you think, legislatively?
Yeah, well, so what's difficult, I think that is an option to increase savings over time, and same for employers who are offering these plans to do that with their employees. But what's difficult with these low-wage jobs is that when you're increasing over time and you have such a small paycheck to begin with, that could be difficult. So I think that 5% minimum, I think, is a good start.
A good starting point.
I would say that UK experience, even though that seems like
Oh, Melissa?
Sorry. The UK experience, it seems like low-income people, that would be the intuitive outcome, and that's not the experience they're having so far with implementing their auto-enrollment mandate. Just something to consider.
So, and that's referring to the UK NEST program, which is a national savings program. They're still sort of being rolled out, but they are seeing a lot of success. Other questions from the audience? Justin, you could identify yourself.
Thanks so much. I'm Justin King from New America, a think tank based here in Washington, D.C., and we've been an active supporter of California and Illinois and some of the secure choice plans. I have a question for Senator Weiler and for Representative Eberhardt. Do you have an expectation or do you have a projection for what the take-up rate and what the change would be in the numbers that John and his team have compiled? What's the impact of this going to be in your state if your plan is adopted?
That's an excellent question, and I actually had some of my colleagues ask the same question, and nothing like this has ever been done before in Utah, or I think anywhere else. I think the NEST program in the UK is vastly different, and the UK is not, Utah, and so my bill, had it passed, would have offered this incentive for 1 year. And so the idea is we could mobilize this army of salesmen who are already out there and give them a new tool in their toolkit to now say, well, if you sign up for my plan today or this month, you can get this $500 tax credit from the state of Utah. And we wanted that to be expiring, so there would be kind of a deadline, a sense of urgency that these private salesmen could use. And again, I modified my bill so you didn't have to just choose the plan that the treasurer had pre-vetted, which I thought was throwing a huge, well, I thought it was a huge compromise for the private sector, but apparently it wasn't enough. And then what I want to do is to, after that 1 year, look and see how we did, and then decide if we wanted to fund it for another year. But I thought just having that small window would really put some, I'm a deadline guy, I'm a lawyer, so usually the court says you have 7 days after this brief to file this brief, and you wait until the 6th day, and then you really get serious about it. And so I kind of wanted to give that deadline so we could have that kind of positive pressure on the industry and on the businesses. And then after a year, we could step back and say, okay, we got 10% more to sign up. Let's do it, maybe we try it again. And so the other thing that I did, and I was criticized for this a little bit, was the tax credit was only available to companies, qualifying businesses, who didn't already have the plan. And so we were almost rewarding the lazy, if you will. But of course, we don't want to take money and throw it at businesses that have already done what we're trying to get them to do. And so, we were. I mean, we're trying to reward the lazy, but how else do you get these small businesses to come on board? So,
Well, it was all projections, but the AARP did a poll in Indiana, polled a large number of small businesses that did not offer. First of all, do you offer a plan? And a wide majority did not offer a plan. And then I asked also the question, well, if you had information in front of you similar to the list in the portal that was set up by my bill, would you be likely to participate? And the number was very, very high. And so that's all we can go by. But if you look at those percentages and those numbers, it was well over 50%. I mean, I'm thinking it was 70%, but I have the numbers in my report. But those are what the information that we had in front of us, and it was very encouraging to see those numbers. And so I have no doubt in my mind that it would have been a successful program if it would have been implemented.
A question in the back right here.
I'm Jeff Hansbacher from the Center for Retirement Research, and this is for Representative Pedersen. I don't know how far you guys got in actually kind of planning this out, but were you thinking of doing a Roth IRA or a traditional as far as, how this plan would be set up, basically?
Thank you for the question. We chose the Roth IRA just because it incentivizes for long-term savings, and so the 401ks, we didn't want to set up something that would be more of a account to pull the money from, but really the long-term retirement savings plan.
Barbara in the front.
I just had a question, wondering what your thoughts are on why the financial industry lobbyists are so opposed to this when, as you said, and I agree, these are really targeted at people, that they're wouldn't be interested in, low earners who aren't likely to, if they do, save, aren't likely to save a lot. So why are they so opposed to, to your plans?
I mean, if you're asking me to read their minds,
well, if you have
part
any
of my plan
insight.
was the fact that the treasurer was going to pick some winners and losers, and so they didn't like the government saying, "Here's we like this company's plan, but we didn't pick. We like company A, but we didn't pick company B and C and D and E." And so the whole industry got together and said, rather than letting one or two of us win, we would rather the government stay out of it. So, and that's what I was accused of, is we were going to have the government picking winners and losers. And in reality, what I was saying, well, first of all, if a company wants to send their salesman out and say, if our plan's better than the state plan and you get the same $500 tax credit, that's salesmanship. That's free market at its best. But number two, we wanted to incentivize the companies to say, to respond to our RFP and say, well, we'll cut our fees, or we'll keep our fees low, or we'll guarantee that they won't increase if you'll pick us. We wanted them to each take their best shot at a low management fee option for these plans.
Good question. That's why I'd like to get them in a public hearing to state their reasoning, because I don't think it would hold water. But the concerns that they would say to me would be similar to what Todd said, and that's that we're picking winners or losers and that we're taking market share away from them. But it doesn't. It allows them to put their plans on the same list as everyone else. My guess is they're not interested in the requirements that we would have put in place, which are low fee programs. They're not generally interested in those type of programs because obviously they make less money, and so that's what I gathered from in my discussions with them, and they just want the government not involved at all and for it to be a free-for-all, which on the surface I'm a big free market guy, but I think the approach that we were taking was a measured approach that really, again, serves a clientele that they probably don't have any interest in anyway. So again, I hope to get them into a public hearing and we can find out what their reasoning is.
The feedback that I kept hearing, I'll just add something really quickly, is basically let's make sure that we're, including financial literacy at an early age in school was one of the strong recommendations that I had. Everybody overwhelmingly agreed that we have a problem and people aren't saving for retirement, but they would also say, well, we have thousands of people who are ready to speak to these individuals and take their business. But as you know, these are not individuals who are going to go and meet with them and sign up for these plans. I think that when you're looking at your bottom line, competing with these low fees would be difficult, but I would encourage businesses to look at this as a new opportunity and for people that they are never going to get to invest in these plans and to really create a product where we can work together on this.
Question from Diane Oakley.
Hi, I'm Diane Oakley from the National Institute on Retirement Security. For the representatives, you were talking about a tax credit for employers. There is a federal tax credit for low-income savers who would save for retirement called the Savers Credit that was created in 2001 and made permanent in 2006. When Congress made it permanent in 2006, it also very clearly clarified that money from the IRS as that credit could be directed back into individuals' retirement accounts, which would help people build more savings by actually getting the match from Uncle Sam instead of their employer. Have you looked at in your plans having some requirement that the providers be willing to take that? Because apparently the one thing we haven't seen in the market on the Savers Credit is that sense of being able to get it easily into your IRA or your 401k plan. So I'm just wondering if any of you looked at that, because I think that would be a big plus. And recently GAO suggested in a report that Savers Credit could actually work to increase people's income significantly when they retire.
Yeah, I did not look at that, and I would be interested in getting more information about that. I think that's something, a component that we could easily build in. For me, the number one priority was, besides management fees, keeping those low, but the number one issue was getting this payroll deduction option at work. And I'm not a low income employee, but I know my car breaks down, my water heater goes out. Both of those have happened in the last 2 weeks. And so if you have the money, if you have the money in your hands or in your bank account readily accessible, there's always somewhere to spend it. And so the key is to have that money removed before it ever hits your your checking account. And that's what we're lacking. And that's what half the employees in Utah right now don't have that option. So I'm interested in that. I'm intrigued by that. So I would like more information about that. But to me, it's all about that payroll deduction at work.
Ditto, interested, intrigued, would like more information.
And I think just, I set up a fund, kind of what you're saying is that you could direct it to a savings fund for higher education, for a college savings account. And while some people do take advantage of that checkoff, it's still a smaller percentage than we'd like. So I think that kind of still is just skimming off the top.
I think we're approaching the end, but let me get one more question from Tim Rouse in the back, I think.
So I'm the executive director for the Spark Institute, and we represent the record keepers, if you will. So in response to your question about, well, what's the industry think? The industry members, and I don't speak for the entire industry, but I can say from the record keepers' perspective that when it comes to coverage, my members are 110% in favor of coverage models for Americans. Any way we can cover them, cover more Americans, we're in favor of that. So that when you think about the two different options that we typically see at the state level, one is the forced auto IRA model. That's probably a good model. Our biggest concern is that we get 50 different versions. And you get 50 different versions, you pretty much undermine ERISA, which has been the model for 40 years. So somebody lives in Utah, but they work across the state line somewhere else. And there's a lot of big employers that these state legislation would apply to. And you think about a large firm like a CVS or something who has stores all over the country. They start to get upset about the fact that they have to keep track of all these state rules, and that's so. Uniformity is one thing that we're looking for. The other thing in regards to the choice programs that you were suggesting, I don't think I would categorize it as being opposed to what you're trying to do. And in fact, the idea of giving the tax credit is something that we're looking to push at a national level too for small employers that don't have plans. So we would applaud you on that. But what we're trying to focus our energy on is working at a national level to create like an open MEP is one of the things that we're looking to do. So if we create a plan that allows for small employers to group together to get economies of scale and drive down the fees, take away administrative burden, and take away fiduciary responsibility, we think that's probably the better approach. So it's not that my members would necessarily be opposed to the things that you're doing. We just think there's probably a different approach to it.
And let me just sort of pose the question to you, because I think it's a really good question that I've heard from a lot of folks. That was really the first part of your question, Tim, which is the uniformity question. And I think whether it's the auto IRA approach in Colorado or even the marketplace approach, where you could be concerned about having to offer financial products in different markets. Are you talking to other states at all about trying to coordinate or have sort of a more uniform approach, or is that a concern? Or are you just trying to get your bill through? Or
Well, number one concern is getting the bill through. But number two, I mean, I've talked to other states. This is the fourth or fifth conference I've spoken at, so I've talked with colleagues at events like this. But I did want to make sure that the plans that we were looking at. So just to be clear, in Utah, we weren't looking at having a state plan. Everything was going to be private, existing plans that were private sector. So they would be portable. I mean, my concern was if someone moved out of Utah to Denver or something, that they wouldn't run into problems. And so I think we had sidestepped that issue. And with the CVS issue, my program didn't have any mandates. So it would be the employer, saying we want this tax credit, so we're signing up for that. So CVSs of the world would make that decision themselves.
I mean, the plans that we had in mind were all going to be portable as well. It's difficult to ask for uniformity when you've got a lot of differences between states, and whether you're a Republican or Democrat state, your approaches. So my hope is there's some core things that we can all agree on, but I think it'd be very difficult to have complete uniformity.
I just want to thank you for your feedback, and I think that it's a great example of if we have people who are the experts in the industry at the table and really trying to set some of these standards instead of just trying to kill the bills, because ultimately some of them are passed, and we all recognize that there's a problem that we need to work on together. I think that your idea is a potentially very good option for the businesses who are interested in offering retirement plans. And then I think that outside of that, once again, is what do we do about the individuals who will never be offered those plans to begin with? And I think that that's something that we need to work on together. But thank you for your feedback.
Well, why don't we take a break now, and let's thank the panel for their insights. We'll take a short break. We've eaten into the 15-minute break. We'll try and reconvene at 3 o'clock or just right after 3 with our second panel. And so stay tuned if you're on the web. We'll be back shortly.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
It was fun.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
much. Let's get started with our second panel, which just sat down. So let me do some introductions, and then I'm just going to turn it over to Angela and Jerry and Lisa. Our moderator is Angela Antonelli. She is the research professor and inaugural executive director of the Center for Retirement Initiatives at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. During her career, Angela has held many positions, senior management positions for the White House Office of Management and Budget, as well as the Assistant Secretary, Chief Financial Officer for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. In addition to her public service, Angela has worked as a public sector consultant and as Director for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. She has a BA from Cornell University and a Master's in Public Affairs from Princeton University. Our second panelist is Jerry Madrid Davis, who leads the Financial Security and Consumer Affairs team within AARP's Government Affairs, State Advocacy, and Strategy Integration Group. Jerry's team works nationwide to promote AARP's state advocacy agenda in the areas of retirement and financial security, among other areas. Formerly, Jerry was the first executive director of the National Public Pension Coalition and was also at the National Conference of State Legislatures. She earned her undergraduate degree from Metropolitan State College. We now have two alumni from Metro State University in Denver, as well as a master's in public affairs at the University of Minnesota. And we're also joined by Lisa Blyer, who is the managing director and associate general counsel at SIFMA. In this capacity, she supervises and coordinates SIFMA's outreach to members of Congress and government regulators on retirement and senior investor matters. Previously, Lisa held positions as vice president and senior counsel at the American Bankers Association, government affairs manager for the American Society of Pension Actuaries, and as a legislative assistant and counsel for Congressman Marge Rukema. Lisa holds a JD from the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and received her bachelor's from the University of Michigan. Welcome, and we look forward to your conversation.
Great, thanks, John. And thanks to Pew for hosting this event and for allowing me to be a part of it. The panel is looking forward to 2017 and beyond, and the previous panel talk had the great legislators talking about the initiatives that they've undertaken in their state. And although with those legislators, they were not able to advance proposals in their states, what I will say to the group is, as we start talking about the outlook for 2017, and this is my opinion, I think the outlook is fantastic. Because to put things in perspective, amazing things have been accomplished in a very short period of time at the state level in terms of addressing the issue of retirement security and the coverage gap that exists among private sector workers. If you looked in advertisement, Georgetown University, the Center for Retirement Initiative, cri.georgetown.edu, check it out. We were started a couple of years ago to really focus, in the absence of really any policy actions being taken at the national level or elsewhere, to really focus on moving these initiatives forward at the state level. And if you looked at the map just maybe 2 or 3 years ago, AARP's great, I'm jealous, I've always wanted to steal your maps, of showing how over time the initiatives have unfolded across the states. Just 3 or 4 years ago, you'd look at a map of the United States and action in the states, you'd see California, you'd see studies going on in Connecticut and a few other states like Minnesota. Fast forward now, we have 8 states that have implemented new programs. So although we've just heard from legislators who are really committed to this and committed to moving these initiatives forward in their states to address this problem, we've already had a tremendous amount of progress. And so why have we had and seen that kind of progress? Senator Weiler from Utah talked about it. In part, it is a top financial concern among families today. It's for many of them, they have too little saved. I think it's somewhere between the order of 20 and 30% of American families have neither a defined benefit or defined contribution savings at this point. So they're looking forward at maybe relying solely on Social Security in their retirement years. Half of the private sector workforce does not have any access to a way to save. And we know the data shows that if you have access through your employer, it significantly improves your likelihood that you will be able to save, having that access through your employer. And then the budget and economic costs. Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia has jumped into this, as have some other states like New York City and Seattle, in addition to the more than 30 states that have been looking at proposals, whether it's to implement an auto IRA type approach or a marketplace approach, or simply to begin to study the issue to figure out what works for them. But the budget and economic consequences are significant. And when you start to drill down, you look at the city of Philadelphia, where they put out a terrific report recently. Again, you can link to it on our website. In Philadelphia, 54% of the population of Philadelphia, working population, does not have access to a way to save through their employers. 1/3, and we're talking about today, 1/3 of seniors live at 150% or below of the poverty level. And 21% of the population in Philadelphia lives on food stamps. That's today. We have 10,000 people turning 65 every single day, and that's going to be the case through 2030. This is a problem that needs to be addressed. And I think the positive is that over the past few years, the work of AARP and a lot of other organizations that are represented here have really made tremendous strides in helping the American public understand the nature of this problem, the seriousness of this problem. And policymakers are understanding the seriousness of this problem. And that, again, in the longer term, if we cannot find ways to help Americans have simple, low-cost, easy ways to save today, and to do that on their own and of their own volition, then ultimately policymakers will be forced to make choices that we will have to accept in order to address this. So it's a serious challenge. Tremendous progress has been made. I think the outlook is optimistic. And I think also on the positive side is, as John said it at the beginning, there's lots of options being considered. And again, states are innovators, national level innovators. There's a lot of thinking going on right now about different models and how to continue to improve on the models that we have to try to address this situation. So as moderator, I've obviously destroyed my prerogative as moderator and sort of contributed way too much here by way of introduction, but I'm delighted to be here with Jerry and be here with Lisa to talk about the outlook for 2017. And I'm going to turn it to each of them for some brief opening remarks to tell you all a little bit about your organizations, the work that you do, and the issues around retirement security and what you're seeing happening today. So I'll turn to Jerry.
Again, I want to thank Pew for holding this session and really thank the legislators who were on the first panel for their leadership on this issue. AARP has always been about retirement security and financial resilience. So this is just really a continuation of our core mission to make sure folks 50 and older, have the resources that they need to live the lives they want to live in retirement and 50 plus. So it really is a continuation. It fits very nicely with the work that we have historically done on preserving Social Security and making sure it's there, not just for this generation, but for mine and my children's generation. It certainly goes along with the work that we've done on public and private pensions for the folks who are lucky enough to have them, continuing to make sure that they can continue to be sure that those are going to be there when they need them, and lots of other issues that deal with financial resilience. But really Work and Save, when states really started looking at this issue in 2012, it was a great opportunity. AARP as an organization had looked previously at auto IRA and had really looked to Congress to sort of show some leadership in really putting something in place for all those folks who, again, don't have a way to save for retirement at work. And so we really, when we saw the states taking a hard look at this and showing some leadership and kind of taking the bull by the horns and trying to solve the problem right now, because if we don't solve the problem as soon as possible, the number of people who walk into retirement who have needs as opposed to those who have means is just going to continue to grow. The folks who are currently retired are probably much better off than, if nothing changes, than some of the folks that we see who are millennials, who maybe don't have a way now and won't have a way maybe 2 and 3 jobs from now to save for retirement at work. You've already heard the numbers from both the legislators and from Angela, but it is 55 million people. Depending on where you slice the numbers, it's at least 55 million people. When you start to look again, as Representative Pedersen said, when you start really to drill down and look particularly at women who will live longer, who will need more resources, it's an overrepresentation of people who don't currently have access or aren't participating in a plan. And that is even much more dire when you look at low-wage workers in the smallest firms and those who are Latino, African American, and Asian. Again, we have an opportunity, given all of the state leadership, to really solve the problem for the long run. I look at what states are doing very similar to what states did in leading on 529s, when we really looked as a country at the number of people who needed to save for college and weren't. And states were the first to say, we got to find a way to make this as easy and transparent and easy for folks to do, parents and grandparents, as possible. States acted, and it was later that the federal government responded with 529, with a series of rules, which sort of made everything very similar across all of those states that were early actors. So we take a great deal of pride for the work that we've been able to do with states that have wanted to tackle this, whether it be in an auto IRA frame or whether it be in a marketplace frame. We think states need to act now wherever they are in time. And at this point, we're willing to meet them where they are. I do think that some of the questions that have already been raised that we'll get into as we look at some of the questions later down, some of this is really not so much a question of it's not a good idea. It may just not be a good idea yet. I think some of the things that we obsess about here in Washington are really next generation questions, as opposed to what's my starter action in the states to get people through the door, to go from giving people access to making sure they're participating, to make sure they're maximizing what they currently can save now and having sort of a trajectory to save more over time. So I will stop there, but again, I think it's a really exciting time, and I have to agree with you. I think the only place we can go now is up, because we've had 40 years of really about half the folks not having access to a way to save at work. We've had some real peak moments. At one point, right at the height of the dot-com bubble, we had about 62% of folks having a way to save at work. 20 years ago, it was 53.5, and the last year we have data from the National Institute for Retirement Security is 54.5. So 1 percentage change over 20 years isn't solving the problem. So what the states are doing is really exciting to us.
Lisa, how about you? How is SIFMA viewing what we see happening in the states today and the issue of retirement security?
So thank you for having me here today. So SIFMA represents the banks, broker-dealers, and asset managers. They're the ones who are managing the assets within a defined benefit plan, a defined contribution plan, in an IRA, a SEP, a simple, all the types of plans that we have out there today, including the 529s and HSAs. They're managing those assets. They're holding those assets in those institutions. So certainly, overall mission of SIFMA is certainly to increase the assets, to help everybody achieve their goals, whether their goals it's retirement security, whether it's saving for college, whatever their goal for their future is, certainly is the same as our goal in terms of helping people to get there. So in terms of where we need to go, I would say that this dialogue is great. Certainly the dialogue that's happening across the states has been a great move forward. The fact that there are so many more states talking about retirement security, because people need to start thinking more about retirement. We are still, as a parent of 3 children, we are still a spending culture, not a saving culture. I'm sure everybody has this issue with their children who think that as soon as they have enough money in their account, it's time to spend it. So thankfully, there are some banks actually out there with some new innovative products that my children are in these, that they actually have 3 buckets. So you actually have your short-term, you have your very short-term savings, that's stuff they take out all the time. Then they have kind of that middle group. That is what they're going to save for. Well, for my son, it was a Razor scooter, which he did manage to purchase recently. And then the longer-term savings. And that is the stuff that I'm hoping will actually manage to sit there for very long term. So the institutions, financial institutions, are trying to think through how they can help people think about those buckets that they all need to be thinking about. So firms are coming up with innovative approaches. We've been working with a lot of the states actually over the past many years. We were very involved actually in the state of Washington when Washington moved forward on its marketplace idea. And actually, I certainly appreciate what's going on in the states, and I spoke to the Indiana representative, Representative Everhart, right after he spoke because I would certainly think that we would be supporting what he is working on in his state. So we are happy to, work with states to move forward to actually help increase the number of people who are thinking about saving, putting money away for savings. Certainly, as we talk about some things, we have some differences of opinion of how you might get to some of that. But the overall dialogue is something that SIFMA welcomes and thinks we should be moving forward on.
Great, thanks. So just, again, to give folks a overview in terms of the state activity. So in terms of, John had set the stage with the different models. With the 8 states that I mentioned, 5 of them have essentially enacted what are often referred to as secure choice, so the mandatory auto IRA approach. We have 2 states, Washington and New Jersey, that have implemented a marketplace approach. And then Massachusetts, John had pointed out, is an ERISA type option. It actually goes back to 2012, where they had put in place a small 401k plan for nonprofit organizations. So that's sort of the broad breakout. But predominantly, it has been these auto IRA programs in the state. So my first question for Jerry and Lisa is to talk about, again, one of the things that the legislators and Senator Weiler in particular had mentioned is he does not want to be subject to ERISA. He made that absolutely clear. And often in the legislation, it has said, this can move forward as long as it's not subject to ERISA. So that became a big issue for states as they were looking at taking action. And so the question was, well, gee, are we going to be subject to ERISA? And that triggered DOL taking some action in the fall of 2015 to put out a proposed rule that dealt specifically with these IRA-type arrangements. And they also put out an interpretive bulletin to deal with ERISA-covered options. So my question to you all is, knowing what's in the proposed regs and in the interpretive bulletins, knowing at this point the interpretive bulletin took effect immediately with respect to the ERISA-covered plans, dealing with the marketplace, the prototype plans, and so on. And but the proposed regs have to go final. DOL hasn't. We're waiting for them. States are all waiting for these regs to go final. So what are your thoughts? What do you hope to see perhaps change? How would you change it as you look to see what comes out in the final regs? Would you change it at all? If you would change it, what those changes should look like, what you're hoping to see?
Right. Well, I'll go. I think our ask in terms of the notice of proposed rulemaking were very simple. The first ask was, please make a clear path for states to move forward. Our second question in the regs was to ensure that auto enrollment could be allowed in both voluntary and mandatory plans. And really, auto enrollment is so important in getting folks, and mostly getting inertia headed in the right direction. We know you're 15 times more likely to save if you have a way to save at work. And we also know, both in the private and public sector, of people that are saving who have access to automatic enrollment are saving sooner, faster, more. So we thought that was important. So we did ask them for some clarity there on whether your program is mandatory or voluntary. We think if you could find a way to make automatic enrollment a part of that, that we would be, again, much farther down the road in solving the problem. And the third thing we asked for, you spoke a little bit about, and we heard a little bit about earlier, which is really making a way for large cities. So in some states, the overconcentration of where the people are is very much in 1 or 2 central cities. And if those large cities can, again, show the same kind of leadership in trying to solve the problem in one geographic area, we think that makes a lot of sense. So that was the basics of what we asked for. We know that other groups have asked for a lot more specificity, and that may be needed at some point. But again, I think for us, it was really trying to tie down some of the commitment we heard from both the president and from the secretary, that they too were excited by what states were doing, and were trying to find a way to clear the path. And so we really wanted to reinforce that we supported that. And I can stop there, and then we can go back, depending on what Lisa has to say. I think that's the basics for us.
So overall, it was certainly very good proposed guidance from them. We have more comments, I think, on the interpretive bulletin than on the proposed rule from them. So I'm going to kind of be in an odd role here in that, we believe in ERISA, and so actually we're kind of a defender of ERISA here in that we like the fact that there is ERISA governing, the rules, setting the same rules for across the country. we would be very concerned if not only the fact that every single state came out with a plan, but then every locality, every city, every jurisdiction. Certainly, you know, when you're talking about across multiple states that a company might be in business, but then when you're talking about within one state, multiple cities, you know, for those of us here, right, the district, Maryland, Virginia, we all move around plenty between the three of them, or we might work in one and live in the other. So if all three, you were auto IRA plans for each of those, and each one with different eligibility requirements, different distribution requirements, different ages, you know, different investments. And so if one wanted to move from one to another, how all of that would work, I think, would be fairly complex. So most of our comments actually defended the path that the department chose to take with their proposed regulation. We asked for a couple smaller items, asking for some guidance for employers in some of the cases, but overall we were very supportive of that. In terms of the interpretive bulletin, I would note that we were disappointed with the fact that they were going to provide guidance to allow a state to run an open MEP, but not the private sector. We would have liked to have seen that expansion, since I think there is overall general support for open MEPs. I think there was a very good hearing on the Hill where actually AARP, as well as the service providers, everybody was on board and wanted to see a path forward. We thought there was much more the department could have done with that particular guidance, even for the private sector.
Do you think it's something that they could have addressed administratively, or does it require legislative change?
We did not think it did require a legislative change. I guess that is something that is subject to
debate.
Debate. And just to go back to what Lisa said, we're absolutely, AARP is a huge fan of ERISA. And having spent 10 years working for legislatures whose public defined benefit plans are not governed by ERISA because they're governed by state legislative rules and the laws of any particular state, I think it is kind of a hard bar for many legislators, because sometimes they hear ERISA as a negative as opposed to hearing ERISA as ensuring that all of those dollars that employees have put in those plans are actually there when they need them. And it really is about employee protection as much as it is about giving a level playing field to all employers who are offering plans.
You're absolutely right. Non-discrimination testing,
right.
All of the things that we
And so
kind of
I can totally understand the bar for some legislators in seeing ERISA as a plus. I will say we see it as a plus. I will also just echo Lisa's point that we are very jazzed about state solutions. We're equally jazzed about national solutions. And again, I think on the MEPS question, there was a recent hearing. We did make comments. We are supportive of those changes. And I do think that in order to solve the problem, we're going to need action in both places. And I will note, just kind of going back to my earlier example, I do think we may have a period, to your point, where there's a lot of variation from state to state, but it's those kinds of variations in the 529 example that really sort of force Congress to act. So I'm personally okay with a little bit of variation if it gets us to a place where more people have both access, participation, and are sort of growing their savings over time, as I hope their salaries grow.
Well, following on the DOL proposed regs in the interpretive bulletin, which essentially laid out a framework of options that in DOL's view states could sort of move forward with. For your organizations, how do you sort of view those options? Do you see all of them as, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom and whatever the states want to do? Or again, is there perhaps one particular option and direction that you'd prefer to see states move in?
I don't think at this point we have one particular, we think this is the best bet. We have certainly worked with, as you noted, the vast majority of states on secure choice auto IRA type plans, but we've worked with other states on marketplace plans. I do think that, and again, it goes back to my point about sometimes there's just legislative resistance at the state level to ERISA. What's interesting about the interpretive bulletin is that that's available to states right now. And we do know from forums like this that DOL has said, State X, if you want to talk to us about how to do this, please feel free to come in. But I do think, again, maybe from a legislative perspective, there's a little resistance to, we're from the government and we're here to help you. So I do think, again, we're just kind of figuring out what the bars are and how to jump over them. But I am waiting. I'm waiting for that state who wants to figure out how to do a map at a state level. I think some of that is political climate. Some of that is kind of willingness and readiness and all of that. But I think it will happen. I'm just not sure that it happens in 2017. And again, I think some of these questions are first generation, second generation questions. What you might do in your first year might look very voluntary. Once you've got folks in the door and they've started to save, the legislature, the public might have appetite for more. And you change over time.
Right.
So for us, we do strongly support the marketplace idea. What we found with some of the other ideas was that there are costs that folks aren't always thinking about. Certainly in some of the states, they've had to have a fiscal note, and when they've done that, they've determined, well, it is very expensive. I think a lot of people don't realize what it actually takes to run a plan. And actually all of the things that might not be front-facing for individual investors, but are in the back room, everything from the record-keeping costs and all the other hidden costs that anytime a state has done a study, that's when they tease out and pull out all those costs, and they kind of realize, well, it's a very costly option. With the marketplace idea, what we've really liked about it is the fact that, first of all, it's not mandatory. But what a state can do is they can put parameters around it. They can require a certain level in terms of what the administrative fees cannot be above for a particular provider to choose to be put on the platform. So the state can put it together and say, well, the fees can be no higher than X. And that's the option that a provider needs to give, that the bank or broker-dealer needs to give, so that they can be considered part of the Washington state option or part of the Indiana option. So for each state, they can set what those parameters are and make sure that it is something so that individuals are receiving, the bulk of their return, and that it's just covering what their minimum record keeping and other costs need to be included. So we think it is a win-win option. And as I've gone to some of these states, I don't do a lot of the traveling because we do have a state team that covers the states across the country, but I do some travel. And when I've gone to some of the states, sometimes it's just a matter of them not realizing some of the options that are out there, some of the things that already exist that maybe they could offer to their employees, or some of the tax credits that are there on the federal level. So some of those other things that people are just not aware of and just need to become aware of. And so we think that the idea of educating and talking to people, getting them thinking more about savings, the overall culture of turning it towards savings, and then having these types of options would actually help move things forward.
So the rubber hits the road. So we're talking about what the models look like, and then we have the reality of states that are moving towards implementation, and we do have the marketplace models, and we have the mandatory auto IRA models. So what do you see as some of the challenges to being able to get these programs off the ground? I mean, we have probably coming down the pike first would be Washington State with the marketplace in early 2017. Oregon would be the auto IRA approach, would be in the summer of 2017. Probably somewhat behind that, we might see Illinois launch its program. Connecticut and Maryland are the most recent ones. California has to enact its enabling legislation and the rest of its legislative session before it technically really has a program to implement. But I spend a lot of time talking with the states. I kind of hear the kinds of challenges and things that they're grappling with, and the marketplace model. Are we going to find the providers? Because the financial services industry and folks have stepped up and said, we think this is the way to go. Okay, but at the end of the day, is there something to turn the switch on? Is somebody there? And then in the case of the auto IRA approach, there are a variety of different issues. Liability being a big concern, how they're going to structure the governance and make sure that do they do things in-house? Do they outsource it? How does that affect liability? There are just a lot of issues, and John touched upon some of those at the beginning, those key decisions that states have to make. So as you think about the states moving towards implementation, and hopefully successful implementation, if you want a marketplace model or otherwise, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges they have to face?
I could start on that one.
Yeah.
So certainly, it's part of why I kind of why we are so supportive on the marketplace, because for a lot of these others, we actually do see an entire structure that needs to be created. And we see that as costly and time consuming. The Washington marketplace, there's a reason it's going to be rolled out fairly quickly, because I think providers are going to jump on it. And I think we're going to actually see, I'm hoping we will see strong success there, so that then other states will see this is something that can happen fairly quickly. It doesn't require that same creation of infrastructure, the checking to make sure they are falling directly in the Department of Labor's guidance, which hasn't been finalized. So for a lot of states, they've crafted something, such as in the state of Maryland, they crafted something, but until the guidance is finalized, nobody's 100% sure it fits in that guidance. And so I think there's a lot of structural issues that will need to be addressed in a lot of these state plans. So I don't know if you've found something else as you've been talking with folks in the states.
Well, I do think that having, a final reg will certainly be helpful for some of the more specific questions that still remain for some states. I do think that a huge piece of this is really going to be all about the procurement process and determining what the state will do versus what other providers will do. So who's the record keeper, who is providing the various types of financial products that will be the investment options, and how many of those do you have? I think in some regards you may want more or you want less, but either way it will make the procurement process very important. I think one of the biggest barriers, and I think those are the upfront, but people know how to do that. We have tons of consultants just here in Washington who can tell you how to do plan design, how to start up a plan, how to run a plan. I think there's plenty of expertise in states and here to solve those problems. I think the bigger issue really is when you build it, will they come? And so I think that really is about setting the foundation of getting people to understand the sort of largesse of the problem and getting people excited about having this access and getting them enrolled. And I think a huge part of that is making it as simple as possible for people to understand. The materials that go to small employers, the materials that go to those individual employees, need to make it really clear what they're getting. And again, I think that does sort of speak to starting with fewer options versus multiple options. And so I do think states are going to have to tackle all of those things. But again, when it comes to record keeping, there's lots of people with that expertise. When it comes to what's the right mix of financial options to give the residents in our state, lots of expertise. I don't think we lack for expertise. I think we lack for, I think the big challenge is what it is with any project. We just have to focus on what we're trying to execute and make it happen and find the best people to help us do that. Some of those folks will be state employees. They might be in a treasurer's office. They might be in an office of budget management. Some of those people absolutely are going to be other providers in the financial service industry or in some other related industry to how you save somebody else's money. I do think there will be challenges. I don't think any of them are insurmountable because people build plans every day. What we know about talking with small businesses across the country in a lot of the research that we've done that was alluded to earlier is that the biggest barrier to entry is I just don't have the time or the inclination to figure out what I need to do. And to the piece that John shared, I may not necessarily want all of the responsibility that comes with being a plan sponsor.
So with all the activity that we see happening at the state level, is one of the benefits innovation within the private sector and response, a natural response to what we see happening in the states? So you talk about record keepers and others. So within the financial industry, is there innovation that's going on in response to seeing what the states are doing? Again, we've talked about the status quo. The financial sector hasn't really stepped up. We have this problem. It hasn't been met by the financial services industry to date. Have you seen some interesting developments that have been triggered just by virtue of the fact that the states have been taking action? And what do you see the directions, perhaps, of the financial industry stepping up in ways that they may not have otherwise, absent seeing what's happening now?
Well, I think the financial services industry is always trying to find some new paths or new ways. When a handful of years ago we started talking more about decumulation and how payout was working, and so we noticed some folks do have annuities and some plans don't offer and some do offer, and so then those who don't offer annuities were kind of looking, well, what's an annuity-like provision that's not an annuity but is something that allows a certain amount. So that an individual is receiving a certain amount every period for the rest of their lives. So I think they're constantly looking at how they can change things. I've actually seen some things actually on a gamified type education to try to get to the the younger crowd today. So I think we're always seeing innovation. I think the private sector.
How does technology? Do you see technology really?
Well, certainly, I happened to go through the RFP process at my own association, and they're doing some pretty great things to try to educate people about what it is they need to get to retirement. I think it goes back to people not understanding, there's what we need to do in terms of our younger generation, but even those who are of working age, just understanding how much you might need to put away. And what you need to be thinking, that it's not even just that small amount. One of our criticisms or concerns with it, the auto IRA, right? It's a small amount, but people need to be thinking bigger, and so they're saying they need to be thinking 10%, 12%, 15% of their pay. I doubt everybody in this room is even doing that amount of their current compensation. But technology is showing us, you're looking at something, you can pull up a screen for some employees, they can pull up a screen at their desk that shows them exactly what's on their account and actually what it's going to mean for them at retirement age. So I think we're seeing some of those innovations. I think it just takes time.
I mean, I think some folks have debated the effectiveness of financial education efforts, but it certainly seems that the use of technology and the types of things that you've described and based on the research certainly suggests that it can have a significant impact. So that type of innovation in terms of how are you educating employees about the importance of saving, and if you put it away, what it means over a lifetime in terms of accumulation, seems to have been rapidly developing in response.
Well, and I think just the retirement security space itself is really a place where there's a lot of innovation happening in all kinds of different marketplaces. I mean, I really do see the work that states are doing as sort of a policy innovation really in this space. And there's certainly been lots of innovation within various segments of the industry. And we do know sort of what the right policy solutions are that we really want to try to innovate around. And Lisa named lifetime income streams. Annuities are expensive for a lot of people, and getting the right combination of guessing how long you're going to stick around and how much you want now and how much you want later and how much that's going to cost and whether or not you can understand any of the paperwork they gave you is hard for a lot of folks. So we need to make lifetime income streams easier. We know auto enrollment works. We know auto accumulation, which is auto escalation, excuse me. Auto escalation, I would agree. Saving 5% over the course of your lifetime is probably not a great strategy for anybody. But having that first job where your wages are low and getting you in the habit of saving and getting you to see what you're growing in your retirement account and how you might use that. I mean, one of the questions we had from the audience for the first panel was the IRA limits aren't enough. Well, we know from lots of research that all of those folks who don't currently have a way to save for retirement at work, they're not trying to save the maximum 401k limit. They're not even trying to save the maximum IRA limit, and there's a huge differential there. So again, I think we know from behavioral economics research, which is everywhere in the retirement security industry, how to change inertia from people not doing what they need to do to helping people do what they should do. So whether it's auto escalation, whether it's figuring out lifetime income streams, whether it's just overall reducing fees so people keep more of their own money. I do think, since from the original discussion of the marketplace in Washington state, states that are having those conversations now aren't saying we need plans that don't have basis points of 100% or lower. Some of them are now talking about 75. And we see the industry even noting their own innovative plans that are 75 or potentially even lower. And so I do think all of the activity really spurs the next great idea. So I really do think that it's happening in both sectors, both in the private sector and it's happening in the public space as well. And I think that's good for, again, ultimately solving the problem sooner.
Can I just pipe in on one other thing, just because you reminded me of it, but we're also, at least if they start with something, if individuals start saving, right, the more they start with something, it gets them thinking about saving, they create a small account, and then it makes them think about it at their next job and as they move along. So I do want to throw out that we have talked a lot, SIFMA talks a lot about the MyRA, and at least as the idea of, well, it's not going to get you to retirement, it's not going to get anybody to retirement, but it is the idea that you have something to start saving with, that, as small as it might be, you have that, and then you add to it, and then you get to your first job, or you get to a job that actually has a plan, or maybe an auto IRA plan, or maybe a 401k plan, and then you're adding it to that, and it's increasing from there. But it gets somebody thinking about saving and the fact that they have a little something and gets them thinking about more.
Right. So 2016, they have a little thing thrown in November called an election, presidential election. So as we think about a presidential election, and there's going to be a change in the administration, and even though it may not be a change in political party, there are going to be changes, and perhaps change in policy. We don't know. We'll have to see. So again, this panel is about the outlook for 2017. So as you think about the balance of 2016, an election, 2017, 2018, and beyond, what are your hopes and predictions for what's going to happen with respect to continuing to address the retirement coverage gap among private sector workers, either the state initiatives, and it's also, as has been pointed out, it's reigniting a focus on a national solution. So what's the prediction in the crystal ball for 2016, 2017?
Well, I will just start by saying, if you look at some of the national polls that lots of different firms do on electoral politics related to presidential elections, where retirement security used to be maybe 20 years ago and where it is today, it was if it was in the top 10, it was a good year for retirement security folks. It's now in many of those same polls, whether it's a Republican pollster or a Democratic pollster, it's in the top 5, if not in the top 3. So people are more and more concerned about retirement security. So I think that in and of itself is sort of changing the nature of the debate. From an AARP perspective, we are very much putting retirement security in the face of candidates, whether they be presidential, senatorial, representative folks who are running. Really, again, focusing on Social Security. We have a national campaign happening called Take a Stand, where we're really asking candidates to say, what's your plan for Social Security? Because where John started, we've got a lot of folks where Social Security is 50% or even 90% of what their total retirement income is. And that program has to be there for people when they need it. And on top of that, we need to solve the problem for the folks who don't currently have access. So we're certainly hoping candidates at every level talk about retirement security, because I think, again, it gets us closer to solving the problem sooner.
So I would echo that we would love to see everybody talking about retirement security, and certainly hope that that is the path that we'll be going forward on. I would add that there are a couple things that, the MEPs, certainly that, tax incentives. I hope that actually as they look at tax reform, that one of the things that's not lost is things such as current tax savings incentives. We need more of that, not less of that. And certainly we've heard some of the proposals have tried to take some of that away and decrease those incentives. But I think we need to continue to encourage individuals to be thinking about savings and protect at least the incentives that we have out there right now.
Okay. Great. Well, we have a few minutes left, so we're going to open it up to questions from our audience here or who might be watching via webinar.
Yeah, so this is, we actually did get a question over the web.
Okay.
And, but I do want to maybe use the host prerogative. Before I read this question, I'm going to press, I mean, all three of you, if I had to pick people that know the most about what's going on in the states, I would pick you three. So I want to know what three states are going to be the first movers next year. So I'm put you on the spot a little bit. See if you want to make some specific predictions. While you're thinking about that, let me read this question, which came from Adam Davis, who works in the office of Assemblyman Robert Rodriguez in New York State. And you can take this however you want, since he's not here to ask it. How do you account for leakage, or when people wish to access their savings before retirement? And I know you've touched on a little bit in your remarks, but maybe a little bit more specificity. So,
But tell them no. Certainly, leakage and missing participants. I mean, I think those two are those are some of the biggest problems I think we need to address. And that's part of turning us into a culture of savings and not a culture of spending. So, people should not be taking money out of their 401k. They should not be withdrawing the money that is intended for their retirement. They lose all the benefits of compounding interest. They lose that. You never can get that back. So, I absolutely think we should be doing whatever we could. I'd have to think about whether SIFMA's position would be anti-all allowing folks to withdraw any money once it's put in a retirement account. It seems like we should be locking it up better. And missing participants is the same thing. Individuals not keeping track of it. And so that's certainly been a concern regarding when individuals, when they have smaller accounts, that they're not necessarily tracking it and thinking about it as they should be. And so we think that is absolutely from a retirement policy standpoint, those are the greatest losses.
We certainly need, to do more around leakage. And certainly I hear Lisa, and I always worry about those folks who leave money on the table. But I do think in terms of leakage, there's, again, a lot of innovation, a lot of ideas about what to do. It's really getting people to really see that. I've laughed because I just did a stint volunteering for junior achievement. And I was so happy to see that one of the questions I asked these middle school students was giving them the opportunity to pay themselves first in the exercise and to put money away for short-term, long-term, and retirement. And again, I think there is a role for public education around financial issues, and I think we're supportive of that. I think the ARP position is that alone is not enough, but I do think we have to spend more time, not just in changing perhaps policy around leakage, but also making sure people understood what they're leaving on the table, and that they can't get it back, and very much echo some of what you just said. So I do think that is a question we have to solve. Again, I'm not so sure that's a first generation question for some of the work that the states are doing. But it's certain, and again, it really gets at, leakage is really an issue for people who currently have a way to save, not really a question for folks who don't yet have a way. Because I do think that there are things you can build in that help you address that issue as people grow their savings.
Yeah, I might slightly respond to that a little bit differently. I do think politically it's a challenge to address the withdrawal issue and the design of these plans. The reality is, ideally, the money would be put away and it would be locked away, and you wouldn't allow people to access. But whether it's the Federal Reserve or other reports that have been done, we know the families are struggling. A lot live paycheck to paycheck. So if you tell them they can't access the money, it does, in focus groups, tend to cause some hesitation. Mm-hmm. And so I think the challenge and the innovation, and I even think some folks, David John, who I'll call out, I always call out you, David, at every meeting, from AARP Brookings, is again, innovation around, okay, well, we want to help people save for retirement, but is there some way that we can design these to accomplish what we need to in terms of keeping costs low and getting the returns that we want in terms of the investment side, and yet still allow some kind of access or other type of savings account to be sort of attached to all of that. So it's a tough issue, and we need to think through it, just given the difficulties that families are facing today.
And just on that same point, we did talk a little bit about some of the tax incentives that either states have looked at or the federal savers credit. And again, if people knew that I might not be able to access that money, but I'm going to get other money that I can, we hope they put in their account.
Right.
But again, that might be another place, instead of putting it in the account, you put it in, you actually start a short-term savings plan.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of ways to cut it. John, to your other question, I'm going to go with my prediction, since they all said they're going to be back for another round. My prediction is Indiana, Colorado, and Utah.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I would add to that. Given the previous panel, we want them to all be successful, so we'd love to see all those states. But then I think you can also look to perhaps Massachusetts doing another round and expanding what they've done. You could also look to New York.
Yeah.
So New York's
Yes.
legislative session's still in, and I think they're out now, but
I
there
have
was
them in my
flurry at the end.
2016.
So New York.
Them in California.
We'll come back. Virginia, perhaps in 2017, they have a study group that's doing quite a bit of work. And then I would perhaps throw there are a lot of other states that are interested. I don't know, Minnesota's been interested in a long time and has some hurdles to get past in terms of the study phase. But there's a lot of states that are interested. But a few like New York and Mass and others that probably have a pretty good chance in the future.
And some of the Western states are talking more about it, given the leadership we've seen of sort of California, Oregon, Washington, and others. So I think Colorado, too, we see a lot more Western action than we did a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Spencer Williams, Retirement Clearinghouse. I just couldn't let the moment pass when we talk about leakage, and then Lisa mentions lost and missing accounts. They trace their roots to exactly the same issue. And I agree with you, Jerry. It's a secondary issue, not a primary issue. But that issue is portability. All right, so we have deep quantitative and qualitative research that says if you make it easy to keep my account with me, I won't take the money. We will never reduce leakage to zero unless we go the mandate route. But right now, the best available data is we can cut it by 2/3. This is literally trillions of dollars, even before we expand coverage. So there is a group working in the private sector in the 401k system. They putting their toe in the water right now about a cooperative model between large record keepers where they enable the movement of these accounts before the leakage occurs. All right, but I would encourage the states to not kick that can too far down the road, because let me tell you how hard it is to remediate it in the 401k industry right now. So,
and I do think that one of the things that states talked about as this whole idea started was really giving people the opportunity to have a way to save, but also giving them a way to keep the money in one place as they move from job to job.
Right.
Because again, unless you're in the kind of industry that has an ability to sort of take the money and keep it in sort of the same plan as you move from job to job, you really sort of need that piece, especially at the onset.
And Spencer, I think it was you. I mean, we talk about auto enroll, auto escalation, and then you have this concept that I think, I first heard from you, which was auto portability. And it's fascinating to me. But again, it's amazing what technology can do and how you can trace these accounts and make it easier so that people don't withdraw the funds because they don't know what else to do, and you actually facilitate moving those dollars into other plans somewhere else. So I think it's
lost and missing. I'll do this without the mic, which is if the money's at your current employer, the odds are way higher that you have a current address there, and you don't have to update every time you change residence the last 5 accounts that you have. That's what I mean by tracing. Same root cause, and if we can sort of bolster that and not put up legislative or regulatory hurdles, enable the process, we're in a much better spot.
Right. Do you have any other questions, web or otherwise? Good. We're good.
Yeah. Well timed.
Yes.
Let's thank our panel for. Again, for those who are here in person, there's a reception down below on the 9th floor. You can go down the stairs or via the elevators. And thank you for those tuning in via the web. And this concludes our event. Thank you.
Thank you.